It is not uncommon for people to say that their votes don't count. Whenever you're voting, it feels as if you're placing your entire opinion on a piece of paper, a ballot, and you're simply placing it into a box. But for some people, it feels that this piece of paper containing your entire political opinion is instead going into a void of a rigged system where politicians have already chosen the outcome of this election. Prospective 18-year-olds, already voting citizens, and yes, maybe those of you who don't even believe in voting. My name is Tejada, and today I am here to tell you that those fears might just be well-founded. Well-founded in a game played by politicians in which they can manipulate district lines to get themselves, their parties, and their political ideology elected into office. A game much like Tetris. In Tetris, whenever you use unusual shapes to get higher scores and clear lines. But instead, politicians are using unusual shapes to get a higher score in their elections and to get elected. This issue is called gerrymandering. And today, I will not only tell you about how gerrymandering started, where it came from, how it works, but also how it's affected us today and why it's an issue that still has not been solved. In order to first go to the history of gerrymandering, we must go back 200 years ago, to the year of 1800. The United States was merely 14 years old, younger than probably most of you here today. It was the election of 1800, and Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was afraid that he would not get reelected into office. He was a Democratic Republican, and at the time in Massachusetts, Governor Gerry and the Democratic Republicans' popularity was falling quickly. So, because at the time they also held the majority before the elections, they thought it would make most sense to change the districts, change them to give them a better chance at winning. And luckily, despite the fact that these districts were drawn 200 years ago, there is still archive of them, so I can show you it and you can make your own conclusion. This is the district drawn by Governor Gerry and the other Democratic Republicans. All of them have almost no form or specific shape, but the one that stood out the most to people was this one that's represented by the salamander. It goes from the southwest of Massachusetts, which borders New Hampshire, all the way through the Merrimack River to the northeast portion of Massachusetts and its coastline. Obviously, you can see that this could create some issues. This being one electoral district could create issues because those in the southwest portion of Massachusetts might not have the same life experiences as those in the northeast. And therefore, their political ideologies may be different, and it may be difficult for them to be represented under one person. But was Governor Elbridge Gerry and the other Democratic Republicans successful? Well, not only was Governor Gerry reelected, despite the fact that his popularity was failing, but the Democratic Republicans were able to elect 3 new members to the Congress. Political critics named this a political salamander, as can be seen by the salamander in this drawing. And from the salamander name and Governor Gerry's name, the term gerrymandering was born. But how does gerrymandering actually work? I'm sure it may be difficult to see with these very old districts. I'm going to show it to you in the most rudimentary way possible, through dots. Welcome to Dotsville, where in Dotsville, the 20 members of the dot population in the north are part of the red party, and the 30 members in the south are part of the blue party. In Dotsville, 60% of the members are, again, part of the blue party, and 40% are part of the red party. What would make the most sense to get the best equal representation is for 60% of the representation to be for the blue party and 40% for the red party. And in a perfect world, this would look like this. 5 districts with 10 dot members in each one, drawn horizontally so they are all represented equally, which ends up with this. 3 blue districts and 2 red districts that equally represents the electorate. But imagine this. After this election, the blue dots come into power, and the blue dots decide to be greedy. The blue dots decide that now that they're in power in Dotsville and in the Dotsville Congress, that they want to establish their place in Dotsville political history forever. So they change the districts to look like this. 5 vertical districts, which results in this. 5 blue districts, 0 red districts. A blue dot supermajority in the Dotsville Congress. And although this may seem like a very bad situation, it's not the worst that can happen. Because, as before, they are still holding the majority, except this time it's a supermajority. So the will of the majority is not completely being breached. Now, for the third situation, let's go back to Dotsville. Imagine somehow, some way, the red party and the red dots come into power. They're sick and tired of the blue dots being in power and always passing the laws that they want. So now that they're in power, they change the lines to look like this. Lines with absolutely no shape or exact form, which result in this. 3 red districts and 2 blue districts. As was said before, the majority in this population is the blue dots. But despite this, because of the red population changing the maps, now the red population is in power, despite the fact that they're the minority. And now, the blue dots' constitutional rights are being breached. It no longer equals 1 right, 1 vote, and the will of the majority is being breached. But, as I'm sure you could tell, that may be very simple with dots. Let's look at some real-world scenarios in which this has happened. This is North Carolina's 12th district. This is Maryland's 3rd district. And lastly, this is Florida's 5th district. Every 10 years, when a new census is taken, every state has a different way in which to redistrict these lines. But over 2/3 of the states don't assign these redistricting committees to nonpartisan groups of people. Instead, the political party that is currently in power are the ones who design these lines, which, as was previously shown, they could oftentimes design these lines to only help themselves and form lines like this, with no form or shape or fashion. For example, this one goes from the top of Florida to near halfway through it. But the most important in these, in order to establish a scenario in which this has not yet been solved, which is where we're in today, is North Carolina's 12th district. You see, 7 years ago, North Carolina was being redrawn, their districts, by a man named Robert Rucho, the head of the Republican Senate Redistricting Committee. Robert Rucho and the other senators took it upon themselves to redistrict and redraw these to only help their political party. In fact, this specific line runs through a town in North Carolina that is split between Democrats and Republicans. But this split changes it from being 1 Democratic city to 2 separate Republican districts. A foundation of voters in North Carolina, titled the Common Cause, decided to sue Robert Rucho and the other Senate redistricting committees because of this. This turned into a Supreme Court case. It went from the local courts to the districts to the federals. And then it landed at the Supreme Court. As I'm sure you would assume, the Supreme Court would probably rule in the favor of the Common Cause, because this very clearly goes against the will of the voters. There were 2 questions being asked of the Supreme Court. First, if the will of the majority was being breached, and second, if they were allowed to rule on this. Despite what you may think, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Robert Rucho and the Republicans. Not because they were right or because they didn't change these lines, but the Supreme Court decided that they weren't even allowed to hear this case. They decided that gerrymandering cases were beyond their reach. You see, for a Supreme Court, or any court for that matter, to hear a question like this, it must pass 4 things called justiciability tests. The first one is called mootness. Mootness says that if something has already been decided on, then it can't be ruled on, which obviously that was not the case for this. The second is standing, meaning that the people that are suing the other people have a good standing in which to say that they've been caused harm, which is true. They have been caused harm. The third is ripeness, which means that this is something relevant, which of course it is. And lastly, and the most important, is something called the political question doctrine. The political question doctrine says that if something is not in the Constitution because that's what the Supreme Court rules based on, then the Supreme Court can't rule on it. Essentially, they can't make decisions in something that would cause them to have a political opinion. Obviously, at the time, or 3 years ago, the Supreme Court thought that was the case, because despite the fact that the will of the majority was being breached, it was Democrats against Republicans. This Supreme Court ruling turned back decades and decades of Supreme Court rulings about gerrymandering, now meaning that no Supreme Court, or any federal court for that matter, can hear anything about these cases, and they simply go back to the same states that already drew these lines. But I dare you to think beyond what the Supreme Court has said, and maybe consider that they've made a mistake. Despite the fact that this district is Democrats versus Republicans, it still may be breaching the constitutional rights of the citizens despite the party. The one right, one vote, one person, one vote right has been breached, as the people in the different districts don't have the same amount of votes. The will of the majority has been breached, as the Democrats who should have these districts don't have it. And lastly, as more Republicans are elected to the Congress because of this gerrymandering, it may cause Congress to have an over 2/3 majority of Republicans. And that could cause for veto powers, meaning that the Congress could overrule the president and governors, etc., meaning that the executive powers branch could also be breached. Beyond that, studies have found that in the last 20 years, because of redistricting and gerrymandering, that Republicans have had an over 17-seat gain in the United States Congress that they shouldn't have. So, what does this mean for you? Now that the Supreme Court has ruled that they may not hear these cases, and the same states that you may be living in are the only ones that are going to be able to make changes. Well, this simply means that you must stay informed. Not only must you stay informed, but you must contact not only your representatives, but your senators, both your state and federal ones, to make sure that they're not making unfair decisions. Instead of letting the politicians win this game of Tetris, take it back from them and gain the higher score. Thank you.